Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. You can hear me better this way. I'm Tammy Denise, Outreach Director for the Connecticut Freedom Trail. As you know, in 1995, August to be exact, the Connecticut Freedom Trail was established by law through the General Assembly to exist to tell the stories of Black narratives and the contributions of the Black community in the makings of this great state of Connecticut. We started with 30 sites in 65 towns, 65 sites in 30 towns, and now we are upwards to almost 180 in 70 towns. And the mission is to have one in all 169 municipalities. The Connecticut Freedom Trail is under the oversight of the Amistad Committee. Today we have with us Dr. Nikki Taylor. She is the author of this fourth book of hers, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, where it talks about enslaved women's lethal resistance. But before we get to Dr. Taylor, just a little housekeeping. If you have any comments, questions, or just want to participate in the show, whichever social media platform you are on, please feel free to reach out. Also, take the survey. Let us know how we're doing and let us know what you would like to see. Now, Dr. Nikki Taylor, she's a professor of U.S. history at Howard University. She earned her PhD in U.S. history and a certificate in women's studies from Duke University. Dr. Taylor has authored 4 monographs, including her most recent one, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women and LethalResistance, which is published through the Cambridge University Press, and Driven Toward Madness, The Fugitive Slave, MargaretGarner, and Tragedy on the Ohio. She also is the recipient of several prestigious fellowships. Dr. Nikki Taylor, welcome to Conversations.
Hi.
So glad to have you with us.
I'm so glad to be here. And I would just start by saying I want to thank you for this generous offer to have me come on this program. I have a lot of respect for the program and you. And also to Michael Sawyer and the entire Connecticut Freedom Trail. So it's quite an honor.
Thank you. Thank you. The show and the floor is all yours. I'll see you on the other side.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone in the audience. I can't see you, but I'm incredibly grateful to have you here. I want to start with an ad that was placed in the Alexandria Gazette, and it was in July of 1852. And I'll read it verbatim, and then I'll get into the discussion. It's entitled, Another Shocking Murder. In Powhatan County in Virginia, a few days ago, Miss Beasley, the wife of Mr. John Beasley, was murdered by a Negro girl whom she had hired in a shocking manner. The deceased had been a long time confined to her bed, and in this condition, she was attacked by this girl and choked to death without having the power to help herself. The girl confessed the murder and is now in jail. So that's the case I want to start with. In that case involved Jane, an enslaved girl. It happened in July of August 1852 in Virginia. And Jane was charged with assault, and this is direct quotes, assaulting and beating, choking, strangling, smothering, and suffocating to death Tamsin Beasley, who was about 60 to 70 years old, and she was suffering from arthritis. Gus Depp was her original and actual owner, but Gus Depp had hired Jane out to the Beasley family. And according to Jane, the family had treated her very, very poorly. She said that Beasley had denied her food just to punish her. That, coupled with the beatings and the incessant work regimen, made her very conscientious of the injustice and inhumanity that she endured under Mrs. Beasley. Now, according to Jane's testimony, the battle between she and Mrs. Beasley started on July 7th of 1852. She said that Beasley had been vomiting, and she asked Jane to get her a bed, like a pans for her to put her vomit in. And apparently, Jane didn't respond quickly enough, so Beasley struck her with an iron poker. Jane had grabbed the poker and used it, the very poker that had been used against her, Jane grabbed it and beat the woman to death. And then she finally smothered her to death, finished her off, so to speak, with a pillow that they reported was, quote, tolerably full of feathers. When they found Mrs. Beasley's body, 2 of her teeth had been knocked out. Her other injuries included scratch marks on her face, fingernail marks around her throat, and blood that had run from her mouth and eyes. She also had a bruise on her right shoulder. She had swollen lips, and one side of her mouth was mashed, and eyes that were very much bloodshot. So the bloodshot eyes, we now call that petechial hemorrhage, which is a sign of strangulation. But nonetheless, as this case demonstrates, it wasn't just the kitchens that historian Vanessa Holden has told us the kitchens were sites of resistance and survival, but it's also bedrooms, because this happened in Mrs. Beasley's bedroom. So what kind of justice system did this young girl face as a convicted murderer in antebellum, or somebody charged with murder in antebellum Virginia? So her indictment said that, quote, she acted with malice, forethought, willfully, deliberately, and premeditatively killed the old woman. The concept at that time of self-defense was pretty much unheard of in terms of enslaved people who used lethal force to resist their enslavers. As an enslaved person as well, due process, which is the constitutional guarantee to citizens that they would not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without a fair hearing in court, before a jury of their peers, all of that would elude Jane. She wouldn't get any due process. Enslaved people like Jane were subjected to something called the Slave Code, which just to give you a summary, it's a separate body of laws and statutes that specifically governed enslaved people. As early as 1680, in the state of Virginia, colonial Virginia, sorry, it's not a state at that time, colonial Virginia created the first criminal law for enslaved people in the entire nation, or in the entire colonial America. And that was called an Act for Preventing Negroes' Insurrections. And that specific first criminal law prohibited enslaved people from carrying weapons, leaving their farms without a pass, or raising their hand to strike any Christian. So even attempting to strike a Christian was a violation. And so the punishment for the first 2 offenses, leaving their farms and carrying weapons, was 20 and 30 lashes respectively, well laid in quotes, for those actions. But the act that I just mentioned also prohibited runaways from resisting recapture, authorizing white people to kill them if they did. The 1680 Act in Virginia aptly summarized all of the slave codes that would be in Virginia and elsewhere. And as a whole, slave codes reflect white angst about Black resistance. They also codify white authority, and they also enshrine Black inferiority under the eyes of the laws. They also restricted the movements and freedom and practical expressions of culture of enslaved people. And finally, these slave codes gave the state, the government, powers and permission to kill enslaved people who in any way resisted authority. And so based on the Virginia Slave Code at the time, the Virginia Slave Code by 1852 was far more complex and sophisticated. So by the time Jane committed this act, an enslaved person, regardless of age, so she was very young, I couldn't figure out her exact age, but they all called her a young girl. So any enslaved person who merely assaulted a white person with an intent to kill could be punished with death. So even if she had hit the woman, that would have been justified a reason to kill her in the state of Virginia in 1852. But even there, even at that time, any quote abusive, provoking, or insulting language against any white person was a serious offense in Virginia. And to put Jane's crime in wider context, Virginia actually had more than 70 different capital offenses for enslaved people, including the obvious ones like murder, arson, but also for poisoning a well, robbery, breaking and entering at night was a special reason to give people the death penalty in Virginia, and raping of a white woman. In addition to those capital offenses, the second offenses for certain crimes also warranted the death penalty in the state of Virginia. And those additional crimes could be abortion, extortion, smuggling, and stealing a banknote or money above $20 in value, and having 10 pieces of coin in their possession. So all of those things were enough to warrant the death penalty in Virginia. Now, according to David V. Baker and Alberto Aguirre, 73% of all executions of enslaved people in the entire history of slavery happened in the last 30 years of slavery. So 73% of all the execution happened in the antebellum era. And most of those executions were in the Upper South. Virginia, for example, executed 32% of all slave executions in the nation. Virginia did. So one state, 32%, which was a direct correlation, I argue, it's a direct correlation to the 70 capital offenses on the books for enslaved people, as well as the additional capital offense if you committed smaller crimes a second time. But Virginia wasn't alone. I'm not here to tear down the state of Virginia. They weren't alone in their imbalanced, say, an outrageous slave code. In fact, all the states had somewhat equally oppressive laws. For example, by 1846, North Carolina had 12 capital offenses that mandated a death sentence for enslaved people if convicted, including hiding an enslaved person with the intent to move them out of state. There in North Carolina, that could get you the death penalty. That state also boasted at least 66 additional felony crimes for enslaved people, some of which, like stealing a horse or burning a bridge, were eligible for the death penalty on a second offense there. In Georgia, there were over 50 capital offenses, including damaging or obstructing a railroad car, attempted arson, and circulating abolitionist materials could also get you the death penalty in Georgia in the antebellum era. So this case of Jane and all the others in my book illustrate at least two important things. First of all, any household object, even soft things like the pillow used to kill Tamsin Beasley, they could all be weaponized by those resisting slavery. Things you wouldn't even imagine were used as weapons to kill their enslavers. Enslaved women didn't necessarily need guns or any obvious weapons that we would associate with murder. They used feather pillows, feather beds, water, poison, their own hands, hatchets, and even fire against their enslavers. In short, any and everything was weaponized by women who resisted this way. And second, the second point that comes out of this is contrary to what any of us might have expected. Enslaved women did resist slavery using lethal force. So as shocking as her story is, Jane is part of a really healthy number of enslaved women who practiced deadly slave resistance in the United States. Her story is a case study, much like the ones featured in my latest book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge. Her case challenges generations of scholars on Black women's history, including people like Deborah Gray White, who is one of the leaders of the field, Stephanie M.H. Camp, and other giants in the fields of Black women's history have emphasized in their work that enslaved women tended to practice something they call everyday resistance. And everyday resistance included insolence, dissembling, disobedience, feigned sicknesses, absenteeism, temporarily running away, and even poisoning food. So despite the varied and creative ways enslaved women practiced this type of resistance, this everyday resistance, historians have previously categorized their resistance as non-threatening and less likely to undermine or challenge the social or racial order. So my work is an intervention into that. Okay, my work challenges this old idea that enslaved women resisted nonviolently, covertly, and indirectly, and even quietly. I found that women like Jane used any household weapon against their enslavers. And not only that, many of them didn't necessarily participate in obvious revolts, but they worked within the household where they were enslaved. Sometimes they even worked alone. Sometimes they sought the assistance of other enslaved people, including their spouses, their children, and even their grandchildren. I outline all of that in the book. So let me interject there and say that I don't want to mislead any of you. Despite my focus on enslaved women's violence, especially lethal violence, was considered the prerogative of white men in the slave era. So usually the people who had the right to do violence and who did it with reckless abandon are the white men. But with Black women, we don't want to just label them with being overly violent. Okay, so I don't want anybody to leave this thinking that enslaved women were overly violent. It was white men who wielded the authority to kill, mortally injure, or maim, not just their enslaved people, but their wives and even their employees, their servants, and even other white men. Yet none of that type of violence, that white on white, free on free, none of that violence could ever trump or surpass the violence that was required to maintain slavery. That violence was at the time unparalleled, incomparable, and incomprehensible in the history of human relations in the United States of America and even beyond. Enslavers, their wives, their parents, their siblings, their overseers, and even their minor children often delivered inhumane and merciless discipline to their enslaved people. Even within the Black community, violence has and still is considered to be the prerogative of Black men. These patriarchal ideas about who can wield violence may make some people listening to this very uncomfortable with the idea of women, especially enslaved women, exercising lethal force in response to injustice. And that can also affect the way we do work as historians if we come in with certain ideas that maybe Black women were more violent than anybody else in our society. So jettisoning these ideas leave a lot of room for us as scholars to properly analyze the women who committed lethal resistance to slavery, not as aberrations, not as monsters, not as crazies, but as resistors. So despite the topic of my book, I still assert very clearly in the book that Black women were the least violent people in American society, because they were. So this focus, nonetheless, on women who use lethal force is a version of history that's pretty much important to the generation that's in school now, the Gen Zers. They're generally not interested in stories about the abuse of slavery. And so my students at Howard actually came to me and they said, we want to see more works about resistance. That's the only reason and way that they wanted to know history. So this book came out of that. But in my book, I challenge how we see Black women as historical actors. I also assert that Black women are leaders. They had ideas, so they're intellectuals to a certain extent, and they also wielded a great deal of personal power, and they had a keen sense of what justice was. So I have found that the women who murdered their owners did not have a global grievance against slavery itself, at least not one that they articulated, and that part was very surprising to me. So these women did not strive to end slavery as a whole, and nor did they intend to murder all enslavers en masse. None of the women discussed in my book killed to secure personal or collective freedom from bondage. Okay? My research shows that when these women seized justice with their own hands, their own ideas about injustice were a central motivation. So this work is also about justice and how Black women defined it at a moment in history when it eluded us in the judicial system. I kind of already told you about the slave codes and how horrific it was to live in places with 70 capital offenses on the books, including minor things. But the historical record includes the names of enslaved women who grabbed their own personal justice in response to the wrongs being done to them by their enslavers. Women like Jane, who I started off the discussion with, women like her who exercised this form of justice did so in response to beatings, which she did, abusive language, which she did, but others did it in response to sexual assault, heavy workloads. That was Jane's issue too, heavy workloads, and threats of being sold away from their loved ones, and sometimes being denied food, as Jane was. That in fact is a common theme, the denial of food. The primary way this kind of resistance is different from others is that personal revenge and judgment were wrapped into these actions that these women did. So theirs was a bloody indictment of their enslavers' cruelty and their own unwillingness to submit to their authority anymore. Because protection and also justice for enslaved women was elusive through traditional moral aspects, and moral, I mean the church, and it's also elusive through legal channels like courts and going to the sheriff to talk about how one's enslaver had mistreated them. So, but in the absence of legal and moral avenues for redress, the only kind of redress that they can get in antebellum society was the kind they seized for themselves, this personal justice. Some people may wonder about whether or not revenge is justice. Well, we know that Friedrich Nietzsche, who is a philosopher, he said that, quote, revenge therefore belongs within the domain of justice. Personal justice or revenge, which philosopher Francis Bacon termed wild justice, is a means of restoring dignity to the victim. Otherwise known as retaliatory justice, this type of justice is personal justice, is usually pursued outside of legal systems or jurisprudence. And as you can see by the Virginia judicial system, the justice that Jane received by doing it herself was the only kind she was ever going to get. So my work is framed with interdisciplinary methods and theories. Black feminist theory in particular prioritizes Black women's voices and their lived experiences, according to Patricia Hill Collins. Black feminist theory, when applied to research, amplifies Black women's perspectives, their values, and in turn shapes the tenets of this theory. not centering Black women tends to lead to a different history altogether using the same evidence. For example, had I not centered Jane and her voice and her experience and perspective, I may have been inclined to believe the ad that I read to you at the beginning, where it said a quote, another shocking murder, and they go on to portray Beasley as the innocent old woman who, for no fault of her own, was beaten to death by a depraved, monstrous Jane. So when you center Black women's voices and their perspectives, then you are able to see more clearly what's really going on. So had I not done that, I would have believed that she just did it for no reason, no motivations at all. And so decolonizing the archive in that way and recentering Black women's voices deepens our understanding and our appreciation for Black women as historical agents. Secondly, Black feminist theory also appreciates Black women's relationships to their families and communities, and how those reign supreme even in the lives of enslaved people. And they dictate much of how they felt, and it also drove how they act, as in the case of people who desperately try to keep their families together. And if they found that it was inevitable, they would escape, they would run away, and some resorted to using lethal force. But nonetheless, the central point of this is that the motivations were often tied to their families and other people in the Black community. So, in other words, even enslaved women had a community-centered perspective. A signature feature or significant feature of Black feminist thought is intersectionality, or the idea that racial, gender, and class oppressions that determine Black women's lived experiences in their relation to power are interlinked and often intersectional. It also seeks Black liberation as a goal. That's another goal of Black feminist theory. Finally, Black feminist theory also insists on Black women's humanity, Black people's humanity in general. So it is inclusive, is democratic, and it also is very empowering and very necessary to write good Black women's history, all of those things. So as an expression of that theory, I constructed a framework in this book. It's real simple, but it's a framework called a Black feminist practice of justice, a Black feminist practice of justice. And I use it to explain Black women's motivations to use lethal force. I term it a Black feminist practice of justice as opposed to simply a Black practice of justice, not because these enslaved women themselves were feminists, because they weren't. Okay, that's a 20th century term. But I use this term because this theory is rooted in the tenets of Black feminist thought. The Black feminist practice of justice emerges from a philosophy of justice. So this is where I get into this idea that enslaved women, were thinkers. Some of them are high-level thinkers. So their philosophy of justice is, very significant, I think, in the historical record. So yes, they had ideas. They had their own definitions of justice. And their ideas is starkly different from how the concept was defined by enslavers and other local officials. In the simplest terms, a Black female philosophy of justice is relief from injustice. On a deeper level, though, it was very practical and boiled down to a sense of fairness and decency, justness, and humane treatment. These ideas, they articulated, negotiated, renegotiated over and over again. So it's very clear that they had this philosophy of justice. For example, in 1859, another enslaved woman named Lucy, who belonged to a woman by the name of Araminta Moxley, and this is in Prince William County, Virginia. And this woman was allegedly the daughter of Moxley's late husband, Gilbert. So she had continued to be enslaved by her presumed father's wife, his white wife. So she poisoned Lucy poisoned Araminta to death with arsenic, and she cited poor treatment as her motive. She understood that her father's late wife had resentment for her, resentment that for treatment for her entire life. And she also understood that this was unjust. Lucy had a keen sense of wrongness of how she was being treated, and she acted on it. But this is what a Black feminist philosophy of justice is at its roots, a basic understanding that justice has to be centered on those concepts and have those concepts as goals. Any failure to honor that basic premise is itself an act of injustice. Chattel slavery is the biggest example of this, but there are also smaller acts of inhumanity that are also evidence of injustice in the history of slavery. For example, sexual assault, denying people adequate food as a form of punishment, as Tamsin Beasley did to Jane. Selling their loved ones is another example, or even disrespectful name calling of women in front of their children. Their philosophy of justice was a powerful current flowing within these women, and their enslavers had no clue whatsoever that they harbored such strong views about justice, which was a serious misstep, as I prove over and over again in my book. Justice was so important to enslaved women that the ones in my book specifically, that they were more willing to die for that than freedom. So again, they were more willing to die for justice than freedom, which is mind-blowing. And I discovered that many enslaved women who used lethal force believed they were seizing justice for themselves. In New York, in one of the earliest records of this type of resistance by Black women, an unnamed enslaved woman and her indigenous husband, Sam was his name, they conspired to kill their enslavers because, quote, they were restrained from going abroad on Sabbath. In other words, they were not allowed they were not allowed to have free time to go to church or practice their faith with their loved ones. That was an injustice to them. In antebellum rural Virginia, 60-year-old Nellie explained why she and her daughter and her grandchildren beat their enslaver to death and then burned his body. She said, quote, "He was a hard master. He was not giving us enough meat to eat. He would not allow any of us to go from home, nor give any of us the privileges which other servants have. He told us that we should stay at home during the Christmas holidays and work." Now, holidays, the one time enslaved people got off was usually the little week between Christmas and the New Year's. And so that was an important time for them to visit with each other and celebrate. It was the only time they got off in the entire year. So telling them they couldn't have that time, yeah, that was an injustice. Also, in 1849, in Prince William County, another Virginia case, Agnes, an enslaved woman, was indicted, convicted, and executed for killing her enslaver, Gerald Mason, with an axe as he slept. By all accounts, Agnes had been upset that her enslaver had ordered his foreman to whip her 2 weeks earlier. Agnes allegedly told other enslaved people that she would kill anyone who attempted to whip her again and would, quote, knock Mason in the head with the club if he, quote, laid hands on her. In other words, the murder by Agnes had been a premeditated retaliation for physical abuse. In her trial, several white witnesses testified that when they arrived on the scene the day of the murder, Agnes told Agnes told them that Mason, her enslaver, had called her a, quote, damned bitch, and he had attempted to, quote, turn her clothes up and take privilege with her, which is a reference to attempted rape. The multiple reasons Agnes provided for the murder all center on revenge and stopping specific forms of abuse, including rape and beatings. Lethal violence within a Black feminist practice of justice is not the first or even the second option that these women use to deal with unjust systems. So again, they didn't just see an injustice and then do the murder. Murder was usually the last resort. They, all the women I talk about in my books tried multiple previous types of resistance, including the everyday resistance before they resorted to lethal force. They used deadly violence only after all the other types of resistance failed. Term slave Chloe, for example, planned and attempted several forms of resistance to push back against her workload, constant surveillance, and beating she faced in Pennsylvania in the 1800s. She said to effect this, she talks about how she was first going to burn their barn, and then she, it just didn't catch on fire. So then she tried other things to try to get away from the surveillance of this family, but she ended up murdering their children. Another Jane, this one in Mississippi, burned the Longin house weeks before. She burned their house to the ground, and then the abuse continued. So then she decided to bludgeon the entire family as they slept. Like Chloe, she may have hoped that the Longins, burning the Longins out of their home would call her in her service to them. In Galveston, a few years before the Civil War, Lucy resisted first by running away. Then she tried to fight her enslaver. Then she set fire to their hotel to try to burn it down. And then finally, she murdered her mistress, or the enslaver's wife. And Rose Butler talked back, stole money, absented herself from work before she decided to burn her enslaver's home. So all of this prior history proves that they had tried other more life-preserving forms of resistance to no avail. One of the core features of a Black feminist practice of justice is rationality and forethought. We would be remiss as scholars and lovers of history to conclude that these women acted out of impulse or rage. No, these are not the quote angry Black women that people might want to paint them with that brush. They planned these crimes for weeks, months, days in advance. They also planned out the day and time of the death of their enslavers. They sometimes recruited other people to help when they needed. They delegated responsibilities. They decided which weapon would be used and who would wield the weapon. And so all of that, through all of that, that's definitely signs that they premeditated a lot of it. They also had very sophisticated plans to escape or avoid suspicion afterwards. And that's the real funny part about, if any of this could be funny, it's that they had all kinds of sophisticated ways to escape, including pretending to be pregnant and other things to try to escape execution. In colonial Massachusetts, Phoebe and Phyllis didn't kill their owner at once, but because they didn't want to elicit immediate suspicion, but instead they murdered him little by little for 2 years with a diet of arsenic, ratsbane, potter's lead, and even raw cashews, which apparently can be fatal if ingested before boiling. But they fed him this arsenic diet in his meals, snacks, drinks, and even the infusions he took for his asthma. And they calculated that if they were to get away with murder, people needed to believe that their enslaver had died of a chronic illness. So for years, 6 years, these women poisoned this man. And they were incredibly disciplined and resisted the impulse to administer larger doses of the poison. But their planning, their self-control, and patience could hardly be considered impulsive. And in fact, when the plot was discovered after the enslaver was dead, it was found that they were part of a much larger web of enslaved people in 2 cities who knew what Phoebe and Phyllis and another conspirator were doing. And yet none of those people ever revealed their plot. So these, of course, these are intellectual acts, and they should be remembered for the leadership in that way. But I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just tell you quickly that some people would argue that some of the things these women did, including killing children, was disproportionate to their injustice. Like, you can't kill children. And we all, of course, today have certain ideas about who and who does not deserve, an act of, revenge. But they also proved through their stories that the children were already deeply complicit in their abuse. Chloe, for example, said that the children were the ones who kept running back to their mother to get her beaten, and she was just tired of the children. And she herself was a child. But to really discuss proportionality of these types of acts of resistance, we have to return to antebellum Virginia, to Jane's story. There, the price for enslaved people convicted of providing false testimony in a trial was to have one ear nailed to a post and then stand there for an hour with your ear nailed to a post, and then to have it cut off after that, and then followed by the second ear. So when we're talking about the proportionality of what these enslaved women did, the wider context suggests that nobody deserves to have a conversation about proportionality when you get your ears cut off for false testimony in court. Virginia's laws also dictated that anybody convicted of any free Black person convicted of committing a felony offense in the state could be prison or, quote, sold into absolute slavery. So again, what an outrageous punishment to be sold into slavery, but that's nonetheless what Virginia was doing. That same Virginia code gave white offenders 3 to 10 years in prison for robbery. African Americans received the death penalty for robbery, even if they were not armed. So it is in this context that any critique of Jane's violence or these other women's violence is laughable. Let me skip ahead. The women who used lethal violence to resist slavery all of the ones in my book, fully accepted the consequences of their actions as they awaited their execution. Rose Butler, who was operating in New York, she was executed in Washington Square Park, and she said, when she was at the gallows, "I am satisfied to the justness of my fate. It is all right." At her execution in Galveston in 1858, Lucy spoke for one last time, expressing, quote, "a perfect willingness to die and hope for forgiveness in the next life." In antebellum Virginia, R.G. Davis told the court that when he told Nellie she better prepare to meet her God, her reply was, "I'm all right on that question." Annis, though, in colonial North Carolina, said she'd follow her owner into the afterlife and kill him again. So the fact that these women persisted in their plans despite the very real danger that they faced demonstrates that they were willing to die to pursue their version of justice. So in closing, I'll say that my framework for understanding women's lethal force is just one approach. Without a framework of this Black feminist practice of justice, enslaved women's actions could seem impulsive, irrational, disproportionate, or even disorganized. In other words, they could be judged using age-old, tired racist tropes, motivated to lethal resistance by different things than enslaved men, which I talk about in the book. They were motivated to destroy the person in power, okay? So they didn't always strive to destroy slavery or the power structure, but instead to destroy the person in power. And then, only then, did they find justice and freedom? Thank you so much. That concludes my presentation.
All right, Professor Taylor, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. One of the things that I appreciate the most about this is, like you said, it had to be centered on the Black women, because again, oftentimes stories are told from someone else's perspective, and to be able to look at the perspective from a Black person who's being oppressed, who's being abused, who's being raped on a regular, and society just looks at it as, oh, well, that's none of my business. What he does in his home is what he does. And I appreciate the humanity that you put on these women. It's not that they were willingly or just woke up and decided to just be violent, or it was just their nature to be violent. No, it came because of the oppressive, hurtful acts that were there. So it gets rid of that racist trope of the angry Black woman, because you can see exactly why things were the way they are. We do have some questions here. I appreciate also where you talked about the slave codes. Here in Connecticut, they call them the Black codes.
Yeah.
You know, just another way to change the narrative, or to soften it, if you will. There was one law when you were speaking about how whites could do certain things and there was no consequences, whereas if Blacks did it the exact same thing and with less force or less intention, they could actually die. There was a law from 1740 in South Carolina, I'm not mistaken, but also the principle went throughout the colony, that if a white person approached you and asked you a question and you did not respond, not only could they strike you, they could kill you and get away with no consequences. And so sometimes that kind of lingers today, where certain things happen where you get the Karens and the Bobs, where they still are under the impression that it's okay to question a fellow citizen, whether they have a right to or not. They feel like they're entitled to that. So I appreciate you bringing out those points, because again, it's important to preserve this history. It's important to let these narratives be known, because history was only taught from one lens or one perspective. And so in today's society, especially with the Freedom Trail's mission, is to tell these stories and to get them out there so that they can understand the contributions that were made. So I appreciate your book. I appreciate
you.
We do have a couple of questions here. It says, how did enslaved women resist the commodification of their reproductive labor and the forced separations of their families? Wow.
Yeah, well, that's a big. I think that answer could take a semester. I have an actual course on resistance in all ways at Howard, enslaved women's resistance. So it's a big question. Is there a way to pare that down?
Well, let's look. It's from Michael. Let's look at just how about the separation of families? Let's take that one, because that's one that's often, when I teach my classes, my museum classes, one of the things I always bring out is why it's difficult for us to trace our heritage, because our families were just sold off, and we had no way of knowing where they went. We didn't have email, telephones and all that stuff. Did they say, hey, I'm being kept up the road? That's not how it worked. And once a family member was gone, they were gone. So let's take it from that aspect of what was the resistance in regards to the separation of their families.
Well, sometimes they ran away. Sometimes they had to beg their enslavers to keep their families together. And other times, sometimes maybe even use lethal force. So there's a range of ways. Some of them, we might not think were maybe self-actualizing, like begging, but it is a tool that they used from time to time to try to appeal to their enslaver's conscience, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so that's a deeper lesson, right? So those are the types of things that they did in general to resist that. But we know for the most part, none of that resistance was successful as a whole. And, because enslaved women had no power to stop their families from being separated and their children from being sold further west. There's some Civil War papers within the Freedmen's Bureau collection where people are actually, after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau was helping enslaved people reconnect with their families. And the stories are heartbreaking. I encourage everyone to just look at those Freedmen's Bureau records and how people were walking hundreds of miles just based on, where they thought their family might be, only to get there and know they had been sold again further west to Texas. And so I think that those records really reveal a lot of the heartache and also what people were willing to do after the Civil War to try to find their children and their siblings. It's really sad.
Yeah, it's very sad and very hurtful. One of the other ways that I know through resistance is sometimes the mom would have the children act as if there was something wrong with them so that their children would not be sold away from them. And then that kind of carried on, into it's a facade, but it was a safety issue. If I deranged, if I act like I have mental illness, of course that wasn't a term then, but if I act deranged or act like I needed to be in an asylum, this person is going to look at my child or look at me and say, no, we're not going to be bothered with that, just so they could stay. And can you imagine how hard that had to be to put that act on all the time? That sometimes people start to believe it themselves just for that safety issue and to stay close to their parents.
Absolutely.
Family. Michael also asked, how did enslaved women pass down resistance strategies to future generations through cultural and oral traditions?
Wow, I really like that one. And I think, they, in general, they passed it down to their children. And sometimes it wasn't even their mothers that taught them about resistance. It was the other mothers, the people who had to mother them because their own mothers had died or been killed or sold away. So they were taught not just resistance, but also how to acquiesce to power, how to dissemble with power, how to pretend in the face of power, pretend, as you said, Tammy, pretend to be blind or handicapped and disabled in one arm. They did all of that. And so and we start to see that in the fugitive slave ads with the Freedom on the Move project, where the owners by that point knew that they had, were faking and said, pretends to be lame, pretends to be blind. And so that, even though it's an ad for, catching an enslaved person, it reveals their genius resistance. Like you're pretending to be blind until the day you escape. And then the enslaver is aware you were never blind to begin with. So those are the types of things I think that was passed down. Some of it was just, they saw resistance in their world. I mean, we were not a compliant, complacent people. There was always resistance. And sometimes that resistance was embedded in songs. Sometimes it was embedded in sewing. Sometimes it was, all the cultural practices, I think, are the best examples of how resistance was passed down through generations from other mothers to children, from sibling to sibling. And so, it wasn't just completely crushing, hopeless. We found ways to push back against the most powerful men on earth, the enslavers. Like that. We have to put that in context too. U.S. enslavers were the most powerful, wealthy men on earth. And you have people with nothing but their own desire to survive. And they pushed back and challenged those wealthy people without any fear or reservation or hesitancy. And I think that is a powerful lesson that was prevalent. And it's hard to document that, right? That's harder to document. That's
more of an oral tradition thing, and it's in the family. One of the things, the subtle resistance that I like is how sometimes they may not have had a powerful way to do it, but just spitting in their food.
Yeah,
breaking tools because now you're down for the day and that's costing you money. And so,
exactly.
I mean, there's ways in which they did it that we don't even think about, that
No,
may have been passive resistance, but in their own way, that was their power of being able to resist and buck against the system, as they say. Now, I have another one
absolutely.
here from Andre, and he
Okay.
says, I
Thank
have
you,
always
Andre.
he says, I have always been curious about the naivety of the slaveholders' ignorance about the consequences to their own evil doings as slaveholders. Did they really think we were that stupid?
Wow, that's a powerful question, but the answer is yes. They really did. A lot of times, stupid or maybe delusional. I
Yeah.
think out of touch is a better way to say, just out of touch. They
Yeah.
believed that we were happy because we dissembled, we put on our masks that we wear near
Yep.
power, where the powerful people rarely know how we really feel about them.
Yeah.
Andre, for example, on your job, I don't know where your job is, but we rarely tell our bosses that face to face. But we
Mhm.
have a culture of talking about them when we get home and to our family. And so, but meanwhile, the enslavers were just kind of out of it, and they really did believe this idea that enslaved people were grateful to them, that that
Yep.
that they that they were enlightening us and
They
teaching
were
us about God.
benevolent. They were
Yeah,
benevolent.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
what
what I like.
paternalism is about, right?
Yeah.
Paternalism, that Eugene Genovese, this concept he came up with in his Roll Jordan Roll book. Basically, they really uh, believe that if they treated us right, that we wouldn't resist in the way that
Yep.
Jane and these others. Yeah, and it's like, you don't get it, sir. We
You don't
are
get it,
tired
sir.
of being enslaved, and it has
Yes.
nothing to do that with you gave us a piece of bacon this week. That's not going to make us
Exactly.
feel. Yeah. So
Exactly. That biscuit that you're offering me to betray my community is not worth it. It's not
exactly.
happening, you know. I also like one of the other things that you brought out that I appreciated was how they didn't try to dismantle slavery because they
Yeah.
knew it was beyond them to dismantle
Yeah.
slavery. So if I have to be in this unforsaken, horrible institution, at least treat me like a human being. And
Exactly.
so I appreciate that they were in circumstances that they know they couldn't get out of, but
Yeah.
what they did was demand to be treated as human beings.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And it's like we have these similar discussions today. How do we deal with crushing power? Like, how do
Yeah,
we dismantle capitalism, which is, the root of much evil that brown and black people have to endure?
yeah,
And so you may not be able to dismantle it yourself, right? So similar to how enslaved
exactly,
people, but I will take care of my immediate person that is doing me
exactly.
wrong.
And maybe
Yeah,
that immediate one act can inspire others to do
exactly.
something differently. Because a lot of times history tries to make it look like we, as descendants of the oppressed or enslaved, have to do this huge blow up thing to make a difference, when in reality, one act of bravery can encourage a whole community, can even encourage the whole world. And one person that comes to mind is Elizabeth Freeman.
Yes,
Elizabeth Humbert Freeman, that one act
absolutely.
of bravery, one act, not only did it help to end slavery in Massachusetts, 82 years later, that same paperwork would be the basis for the Emancipation Proclamation. So sometimes that one act makes all the difference.
Absolutely.
Here's another question. Michael says, how did enslaved Black women's participation in religious communities and spiritual practices contribute to resistance efforts? Ooh.
I like that one. And I go to the first chapter in the first book, Phoebe and Phyllis,
Yes,
Colonial Massachusetts.
yes.
And you would think that, oh, they're there, there's whites everywhere, they're far
Mhm.
outnumbered. But there's evidence, excuse me, my allergies are bothering me, but there's evidence of them practicing their culture, what we would call traditional African faith and practices. And so they had knowledge of herbs, plants, what plant would do. And that was just like mind blowing to me, that they, like the thing about cashews.
Yeah,
like
that was mind blowing.
Right.
Yes. Like, wait, what? I love cashews. Wait.
I know. I said, not cashews being able to kill you. So and I looked it up, and it's true. And so I just said, wow, the genius that these people had, but they were persisting. In fact, one of the people in the Massachusetts case they said he had been enslaved on one of the islands.
Mm-hmm.
He was convicted there of being a poisoner. So they're sending to Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, as a punishment. And then he's teaching those Black people how to poison, not just with herbs, but also with household cleaning agents like ratsbane. Ratsbane that I mentioned in the talk is rat poison. And so, yeah.
Amazing. Sometimes the punishment actually is a way to even spread the word. It's sort of like with the Bible. They were punishing people left and right, but yet as they sent people away, what were they doing? They were literally spreading the message that they were to all. Andre says, thank you, Dr. Taylor, for your eloquence while approaching an often seldom discussed arena of Black history. This is research, writing, and storytelling.
That was really sweet. Thank you, Andre.
Greatheart Griot, who was a storyteller himself. So.
Oh, wow, you're kidding. Wow. Yes. Well, thank you for coming, Andre, and for your compliments and your questions. What a way to participate.
Well, as we are closing, before I close, I wanted to talk about Phoebe, Phyllis, and Mark, who designed a plan to burn down the blacksmith shop and workhouse. There is an artist by the name of Ife Franklin in Boston. She recently just did an exhibit dedicated to these three individuals. Wow. So I can't tell you exactly where it's located because it slips my mind, but she's a very talented woman. If you get a chance, look it up. All of you out there in social media land, look it up. And if you're in the Boston area, please go and visit it, because not only do you get a more in-depth detail about them from the legal standpoint and why they pursued it, but you can actually see this exhibit dedicated to these three people who were resistors. You know, they were resistors in all shape, manner, and form, and did not give up or give in. So, Dr. Taylor, I appreciate you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
You weren't feeling well with your allergies, but you did a bang-up job.
Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you so very much.
I really appreciate you and this invitation. Thank you to the guests for coming. I just really appreciate all the comments and questions and compliments. Thanks, Andre, again.
Well, hold on one moment for me as we end the show.
Okay.
All right, everyone. This is the end of our Conversations at Noon with Dr. Nikki Taylor. If you have not had an opportunity, here is her book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance. So if you ever wondered or you ever thought how it just didn't make sense that Black women were so demure, but yet could be the angry Black woman trope, now you have a book that can give you that information and show you the insights and show you the perspective from Black women who were enslaved and mistreated and how they resisted such. Again, thank you so very much for taking the time to come and join us at this program. Our upcoming programs next month, we have Mary McLeod Bethune, the Pan-Africanist, a conversation with Dr. Ashley Preston. And then in May 27th, Tuesday, we have Harriet Tubman, military scout and tenacious visionary, a conversation with Rita Daniels. And that conversation actually kicks off our Descendants series, where we have descendants who will either be speaking about their first family connections to those who were here before the making of the country, or we have authors who have written books. So thank you again so very much, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate the support. Until the next time.